I'm Afraid by Erwin K. Oppenheimer. Translated by RAUL VASQUEZ. Narrated by QUANEY. Part 1. The Atomists Go to War. Chapter 1. I will always remember that morning in June. Never had a summer in California been so beautiful. From my work office window, I could see the great green lawn spotted with colorful flower beds spinning up to the dark shadows of the sequoias. Along the right, by a bed of rhododendrons, the pool's water jet made its silvery tinkle. And, echoing, there was the laughter of Johnny, my son, who was teasing his nanny, a good old negress born in the suburbs of New Orleans. I remember exactly the moment when I stood up, propped my hands on the desk, and leaned in to follow my son with my gaze. He was pulling a leather strap from Doris, his bulldog. He was happy. His blonde hair shone in the light of the American sun. He saw me. He waved. Then he yelled, "Hello, Pop." I had no time to answer him. The phone rang. On the other end of the line was the familiar voice of my assistant, a charming mixed Mexican fellow named Bill Ramon. "It's a boy," he said. Among atomic technicians, saying, "It's a boy," did not mean Bill Ramon's family had recently grown by an offspring. This expression simply meant that the ongoing experiment was a success. "Is it true?" I asked, my voice trembling. "It's all true, boss." "Good. Wait for me. I'm on my way." These minutes are forever etched into my memory. For another moment, I let my eyes wander over the radiant nature. Everything here was peace, calm, sovereign order, and sovereign happiness. But a few kilometers from my home in Livermore, a few kilometers from this man-made paradise, behind huge walls, at the end of a maze of corridors illuminated day and night by cold neon lights, protected by triple armored doors, other men had just succeeded in discovering the secret of the end of the world. Johnny now danced in the golden light like a young pagan god. If we had not lost the war, his name would have been Hans, like his grandfather, and he would have been German. Perhaps he might have even taken my place at the old citadel of Göttingen, where I was once a student. But it was no longer worth thinking about. His name wasn't Hans, but Johnny. He wasn't German, but American. If I had one pressing obligation, it was to become my child's true compatriot. I accepted this American nationality along with 27 other former colleagues from the atomic research centers of the Third Reich. I accepted it in July 1945 when I boarded a U.S. Air Force B-29 that delivered me, some days later, to the New York airport. I accepted it in the grand amphitheater at the University of California at Berkeley, where the rector, dressed in ceremonial attire, awarded me the title of Citizen of the New World. I stood before him. I stared at him. I did not blink when he ended his speech with these words: "You have been adopted by the land of liberty. Show yourself worthy of the trust placed in you." From that day forward, I tried to empty my mind. Not only was it necessary to refuse to look back at the past, it was also necessary to accept and adapt. Johnny, my wife, and I were safe in America. In this century, what more could one ask for from a country? Besides, there wasn't much difference between the nuclear laboratories in Hitler's Germany and the ones in democratic America. Our guardian angels had the same faces, the same stealthy and diligent looks, the same heavy and quick gaits. Just as before, I did not know what it was to be a free man. I was a scientist, chained to his laboratory, a prisoner of my work and of the huge political police apparatus that stood to gain from this work. "Pop! Pop!" Indifferent to the climbing roses reaching up to my window, Johnny appeared suddenly in its frame. He was a little out of breath. He held a colorful ball in his hands. "Pop," he repeated. "Will you come play with me?" "No, son," I replied mechanically. "Leave me alone. I have a lot of work to do." He pouted, half seriously, half teasing. "You never have any time to play with me," he said. "Is your work really that important?" I didn't respond. I stood up and walked over to him. In a measured gesture, so as to not frighten him, I pulled his blond head in toward my chest. The words, "It's a boy," reverberated from deep within me. In that moment, I felt a kind of diffuse pity, a mixture of fear and despair, rather than a profound love for my son. Johnny dropped his ball into the room. I watched it roll in. It could have fit into my hand. I couldn't help thinking that, thanks to my colleagues and I, about a dozen balls this size would someday be enough to burn down cities like Paris, London, Rome, Moscow, and New York. Like in a nightmare, images suddenly flashed through my mind. As if watching a film, I could see Carrenhall Castle, Marshal Göring's summer residence, where we had been taken to 10 years earlier. Marshal Göring raised his hand for the German salute, but did not look at us. His eyes were fixed firmly on a document. We waited in silence. "Have a seat, gentlemen," he finally said, still not looking at us. "Reichsminister Himmler will tell you why it is that you have been summoned." This is how we learned that the Italian Enrico Fermi had built a nuclear reactor in Chicago, and that President Roosevelt had just given the order to build the atomic bomb. Certainly, the Führer hoped the war would be over before this diabolical weapon could be used, but we had to enter the race immediately. We had to prove to the world that we were as strong as the Americans in atomic disintegration as we were in all other aspects. "As of this moment, consider yourselves frontline soldiers," added Reichsminister Himmler. "Orders are coming that will provide each of you with a residence as well as your work assignments." A month later, I was installed in a house a few kilometers from Innsbruck. My wife was authorized to join me. Her sister, a party member in Bavaria, vouched for her loyalty. From Innsbruck, I was transferred to Hamburg, and then to Peenemünde. When the Russians arrived, I was evacuated from Peenemünde and detained in a prisoner of war camp. On June 17, 1945, an American sub-officer told me that I should prepare for a long journey. "Where are we going?" I asked. Dryly, he replied, "You'll see." 2 weeks later, accompanied by Hans K. and Julius W., two of my Innsbruck colleagues, I was riding in an elegant Buick while crossing the great forest that runs along the highway from New York to Washington. The military police followed behind in 2 jeeps. I was beginning to doze when the loud squeal of the brakes suddenly awakened me. Our car turned sharply. After crossing a wrought iron gate, we entered an enormous and remarkably well-maintained park. Neo-Gothic structures, similar to the villas that could once be found in Nuremberg's residential areas, stood amidst a cluster of trees. Each rested about 100 meters from the next. I read the words, "Princeton University," engraved on a plaque on one of the doors. Somewhat foolishly, I thought that our misfortunes were about to come to an end. I thought that we would once again be treated as men of science, not as criminals. Surely we would meet with our American colleagues. Undoubtedly, they would know about our work, our successes, and our setbacks. In any case, we would meet with people with whom we could recommence the dialogue. There was no sentry on duty, as a matter of fact, either for this elegant tower or its comforts which were so characteristic of American decor. A young woman in the center of the room smiled, and she was so perfect. Her skin was so bright, her eyes so clear, her lips so beautifully drawn that one could have mistaken her for one of the hundreds of magazine cover girls in the USA. She asked us to sit and offered us a drink. As we were declining the offer, a door opened, and in walked a man we knew well. It was Albert Einstein. His hair and his mustache had turned white. His face bore more wrinkles than when he had spoken to us long ago in Göttingen, but his eyes were as bright and mischievous as ever. They stared at each one of us for long stretches, and there was a friendly greeting in his look that prolonged a question. A faint smile brightened the corner of his lips. Then, suddenly, the smile vanished. Einstein shrugged his shoulders. He turned his back on us and addressed a young man with curly hair and horn-rimmed glasses hanging over his nose. "Tell the Nazi scientists that they should start by giving us a full report about their past activities," he said. "Also, counsel them to tell the whole truth if they wish their stay here to remain pleasant." He spoke in English. Clearly he wanted to demonstrate he was unwilling to speak German, the language of his native country, which he had to abandon in order to escape its racial persecution. The young man acting as an interpreter approached us to translate what Albert Einstein had just said. "There is no need," I said. "The three of us understand English." Einstein spun around as if he had experienced an electric shock. He pointed his gnarled index finger at us. "Erwin Oppenheimer," he said to me, "I know your zirconium made you very successful. If my information is correct, it even earned you an Iron Cross which Mr. Adolf Hitler himself pinned on your jacket lapel. I do not possess that kind of power to award you such a medal, but allow me, in turn, to congratulate you. Zirconium will be of great use to the United States." Hans, Julius, and I looked at each other in silence. This welcome from the great scientist stunned us. Had he brought us here to reproach us for having worked in our country's laboratories during wartime? Julius W. took the floor. "Was it to tell us these unpleasant words that you brought us here from across the Atlantic?" Albert Einstein let out a sour chuckle. He rubbed his palms together vigorously. I know," he said. "You are all the same. You have the sensitivity of a skinned cat, or, better yet, of someone innocent. Because you are innocent, of course. You never participated in politics. You only labored under duress. You only wanted peace and universal brotherhood. Others before you have already told me such nonsense. But that didn't stop Hitler from getting to within a few weeks of crushing us all under under your uranium bomb." The astonished looks on our faces surprised him. "I am familiar with all of your work," he continued, "and it is precisely because I consider it dangerous for the future of humanity that I urge the United States government to bring you here and to keep you at our disposal. You will not be harmed. We are not savages," he said as his voice swelled. "You will be treated well, as human beings, well fed, well housed, and even well paid. When an opportunity like this appears out of the blue, precisely at the moment when you feared that your only recompense should be the hangman's noose, you can rejoice. So, rejoice, since in exchange for this special treatment that you'll receive, only one thing is asked of you. How did you solve the problems that you know about? What projects were you working on when the Russian and American armies smashed your army? As I already explained, I expect a full report from you on these matters." Without salutation, the father of relativity turned his back on us and walked out. We were flabbergasted. The curly-haired young man with glasses informed us that we would be housed in some barracks about 10 kilometers from Princeton. Other Germans, atomic technicians like ourselves, were already there.